Another day, another set of players eligible to return to college football because the NCAA just can't figure out how to have rules. You see, earlier this week, 16 players were given one more year of eligibility to return to college football, and most of these players are kind of like fringe NFL caliber players, undrafted type of players that may or may not make their rosters for football. And before you tell me that Ohio State has no shot or would never be willing to add or take any of these guys, stick with me because I am going to address that as well in this video. I want to talk about all the possibilities, but the meat of this video will be that there are 5 players that actually make sense for Ohio State to be a possible destination if they return to college for this season. So I'm going to tell you those 5 guys from least to most likely that could join Ohio State and why Ohio State could be more likely to get involved in them than many might think. Because there's another layer to this story that matters just as much as whether Ohio State wants these guys. Do these players even want to come back to college? Some do. Some apparently might. One is already in the transfer. Actually, 2 is in the transfer portal, and a couple could probably be insane to leave their current NFL opportunity unless something changes. So to keep it real, I'm going to answer 2 questions. Would he help Ohio State with each player? Would he help Ohio State? And then more importantly, can Ohio State realistically get this player? Because by the time we reach number 1, there is a player who is no longer on an NFL roster, who has already entered the transfer portal and would fill one of the few areas where I think Ohio State could still make a championship roster noticeably better. So I'm John Rhodes with BuckeyeHuddle.com, and I'm excited to get into this one with you. And let's do that, because if you did not hear, here's kind of what's happening and why there's some players all of a sudden available. You see, the newest court action involving players affected by the NCAA's eligibility rules has created an unusual pathway for certain former college players, including guys currently in NFL camp, to potentially play another season of college football. But being eligible doesn't mean that you are also available. And that's why we're starting with guys that I think is probably the least likely to actually come back, and then we'll get to the ones who are most likely as we get through the rankings. So coming in at number 5, least likely of the guys that I think could possibly go to Ohio State, I've got Jack Pyburn. Now, Jack Pyburn might actually be one of the best football players on this entire list. He also might be the hardest to convince to return to college. Pyburn played at Florida before transferring to LSU, where last season he finished with 52 tackles, 5.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and 8 quarterback hurries. He then went undrafted and signed a 3-year undrafted free agent contract with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in May. And as of right now, he is still there. Pyburn is on Tampa Bay's active preseason roster. He's wearing the number 58 and competing for a spot at outside linebacker. And here's what makes this important. Pyburn isn't hanging around NFL camp doing nothing. He just had 2 sacks in a preseason game. So when we ask, would Jack Pyburn actually come back to college? My answer right now is honestly probably not, unless Tampa Bay makes that decision easier for him. Jack Pyburn is where the entire eligibility situation becomes completely absurd. This guy isn't sitting at home because the NFL didn't want him. He's currently on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers roster. He signed an undrafted free agent contract in May, and he just recorded 2 sacks in a preseason game. And we're now talking about whether he could go back to college football. Under this new court situation, Pyburn has a possibility, a possible path back, but he'd have to get out of his Tampa Bay contract in time. And that's why I don't think Ohio State should be expecting him to even come back to college. If Tampa tells Pyburn, you're making this football team, I don't know why he would think he would go away from the NFL and come back to college. But if Tampa cuts him, then I'm calling immediately to see if he could come to the Buckeyes, because Ohio State would suddenly have a chance to add an SEC edge defender who's already shown he can get an NFL quarterback on the ground. That's the dividing line with Pyburn. His NFL status is very much alive. I think he did want to possibly come back, and Ohio State could use him, but at this point, with how he's playing, it does not seem likely. The ruling gives him the option to leave the professional path and return, but that is very different from Pyburn, publicly saying he is definitely doing it. And Ohio State doesn't desperately need another edge. They already have Kenyatta Jackson, Bo Atkinson, Zion Grady, and Quay Rousseau to, have a good room already. Now, it could be better. That isn't the perfect room. They wouldn't pass on an NFL caliber pass rusher if he all of a sudden unexpectedly becomes available. But I just wouldn't bet on Pyburn ever reaching that point for the Buckeyes to be able to go after him. So going from there, at number 4, I'm going with Wydette Williams Jr. Wydette Williams is another player where the NFL gets its first crack at determining this. Williams was really good at Ole Miss last season. He had 73 tackles, 3 interceptions, 10 pass breakups. He then went undrafted and signed with the Arizona Cardinals. And unlike another player who we'll get to later, Williams is still on Arizona's roster. He's number 31. He played in the preseason. He recorded 7 tackles in his preseason debut. So right now, Williams is actively trying to become an NFL player. But here's the interesting part. The court ruling allows Williams to continue pursuing his NFL opportunity through preseason while also preserving a possible college option if Arizona ultimately doesn't keep him, which is insane, but that's the world we live in because the NCAA apparently can't keep anything straight. That's almost like, trying to make 2 roster decisions at one time. Try to make the Cardinals, but if it doesn't work out, if it does work out, you're in the NFL, but if it doesn't, suddenly college football might be sitting there for you to be able to go to. And there is reporting out there that has indicated that Williams could potentially return if he's released within the deadline established by the order. But I want to make something clear. I have not seen any credible reporting that Williams has decided that he's leaving Arizona to go back to college, and that's why he's 4th on this list. This appears much more like an option than a plan, and honestly, if he makes Arizona's 53-man roster, I'd expect this entire conversation to become mute. From Ohio State's perspective, safety isn't a desperate enough need at this point. They're already planning to rotate 3, maybe 4 guys at that position, so if he's got a shot at an NFL job, I don't know why he would take it. But if Arizona releases him, then the conversation might become a little bit different, but I would assume other teams would probably be more in the mix there, specifically Ole Miss, who he was at before. Next is number 3, Daquan Wright. Now, this is where the NFL return question gets a lot more interesting, if you ask me, because there are legitimate signs that Daquan Wright may actually want to play college football. Again, Wright was second-team All-SEC last season at Ole Miss, and he is the type of tight end that Arthur Smith would be intrigued by. Last year, he had 39 catches, 635 yards, 5 touchdowns, and more than 16 yards per catch. Then he went undrafted and initially signed with the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles waived him last week. Cleveland came in, they claimed him, and they got him the next day. So technically, as I'm recording this right now, we're literally getting news as I'm recording this now on this. Technically, as I'm recording this right now, Daquan Wright is still a Cleveland Brown. NFL.com still lists him on the Cleveland's active roster. But that's only half the story, because at the time of me recording this, Wright, just about 10 minutes ago, entered the transfer portal after being away from Browns training camp. Cleveland has even been looking at additional tight ends to possibly bring another one in, which, if you ask me, tells me that this is a much different situation than the Pyburn one that we talked about. With Pyburn looking like he's going to be having a real NFL career in front of him, Wright might actually be trying to do exactly the opposite of that. Excuse me. Now here's the confusing part for Ohio State, because the obvious destination being discussed here is Ole Miss, and that's where he played, that's where he knows the offense, that's where he had success. But he just entered the portal, and if you haven't been paying attention, SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey sent out a letter to the entire SEC last week saying he does not want SEC schools to jump on signing players like Wright immediately and to approach these things with caution, talking about going to your compliance department, talk to them. So with Wright entering the portal, I think it's safe to assume he will likely either get released or step away from the Browns entirely. But still, I have to think Ole Miss would still be the favorite here. But if they play around with him too much and they try to act like, oh, well, maybe we take him, maybe we don't, maybe Ohio State or another team will come in and try to take him away and try to get him. And this would be a position that Arthur Smith would certainly love to investigate with how much he loves to utilize tight ends in his offense. Now, Ohio State does have tight end talent. This isn't a position where like Ohio State doesn't have any talent there or anything. Nate Roberts appears to be the guy you're kind of building around. They have some other, Mason Williams, Hunter Welsi, and Bennett Christian, some other guys that can do stuff for you too. But Wright is a veteran receiving threat who has already proven he can produce against SEC defenses. And Arthur Smith loves multiplicity with tight ends. Imagine Roberts and Wright together. You can line up heavy. You can motion right, split them, split one of them out, run play action, force a defense to choose whether it wants linebacker personnel or another defensive back on them. That would be useful immediately. So my evaluation here is that the NFL status is that he currently is on. He's currently under contract with Cleveland. Makes it a little bit more iffy, but he is not with Cleveland, if that makes sense. He has the contract, but he's not with Cleveland, so that makes it even more kind of interesting in how that works. That makes the likelihood of him returning to college much, much more legitimately possible, if you ask me. But the likelihood of Ohio State specifically getting him isn't bad. I just would still think Ole Miss appears to make far more obvious sense, and that's why I have him at number 3. And also, if you look at the Max Clare situation last season, Ohio State does have a thought process about them sometimes that just because you are a receiving threat elsewhere doesn't mean you're going to come in and be the receiver, the complete receiver and blocker that you want. And if that is still a value that Ohio State and Keenan Bailey holds, then this would be one that might not work out. But Arthur Smith has the ultimate trump card, and if he wants to bring him in, he could possibly do it. At number 2, I have Trent Hendrick, and the Trent Hendrick situation is rather puzzling because with Hendrick, there isn't an NFL contract standing in Ohio State's way. There's a college transfer rule standing in the way. Hendrick was the Sun Belt Defensive Player of the Year at James Madison. He had 106 tackles last season, 7 tackles for loss and 3 sacks, also had 2 forced fumbles, and he finished his career with 209 tackles. He went undrafted this spring and participated in rookie minicamp with both the Cleveland Browns and the Kansas City Chiefs. But this distinction is incredibly important. Hendrick never signed an NFL contract. He was a tryout player. So unlike Pyburn, Williams, or Wright, there isn't currently an NFL team that has to release Trent Hendrick for him to come back to college. And we don't have to speculate about whether he'd consider playing college football again either. His representative told On3 earlier this month that Hendrick was exploring a return to college football. So much so that the team up north even contacted him. More on that later, but they did contact him. So there is no NFL obstacle, and he does have an interest in returning. And that's why football-wise, this is a good idea and something that Ohio State could pursue. Trent Hendrick might be the most interesting player Ohio State can simply go after. He was the Sun Belt Defensive Player of the Year, Kansas City, both Cleveland had him in camp, and his representation has already confirmed he's exploring the college return. So what's stopping Ohio State? Well, it's the transfer rules. And originally, eligibility injunction gave Hendrick another potential season, but a follow-up ruling clarified that existing transfer rules weren't automatically erased. Because Hendrick didn't enter the transfer portal during the normal window, indicating his cleanest path back, he may have to only return to James Madison if he wants to come back to college football. Now, I understand. I'm getting a little confusing here. I need to clarify this. You're probably asking, why can, Daquan Wright go into the portal, and there's another player, the number 1 player is already in the portal, but Trent Hendrick cannot. And it's because Daquan Wright and the next player I'm going to talk about are benefiting from a different court order than what Trent Hendrick is benefiting from. Trent Hendrick is benefiting from the Colorado one, and the relief those orders granted is not exactly the same. Daquan Wright got his right from the Louisiana order, which specifically opens the portal. Wright is a named plaintiff in the new Louisiana lawsuit. It doesn't open the portal for everybody, but it opens the portal for those those players that were in that lawsuit. That court's temporary restraining order did more than just simply give the plaintiffs another season of eligibility. It created a temporary path for the affected players to enter the transfer portal, including players currently in NFL camps. Now, if Hendrick can get in the portal, if something happens with the Colorado ruling there and he can get in the portal, I would absolutely think that Hendrick could be a possibility for a number of Big Ten schools and maybe even in Columbus. Not because the linebacker room in Columbus is in trouble, but because he is a solid football player who could carve out a role in Columbus. He's a guy who, played under Kirk Cinetti. He played under Bob Chesney this past year. The question isn't whether he wants to be in college football. The question is whether college football legal mess will actually let Ohio State get a chance at him. And that distinction changes how I would talk about Hendrick. Earlier, you could hear that Michigan contacted him and assume, oh, okay, well, it's open recruiting. But not necessarily. The follow-up clarification left normal roster and transfer restrictions in place, which created a much harder path for someone like Hendrick, who had already exhausted eligibility and didn't enter the portal during the original window. So right now, kind of simplest way to put it, I would describe Hendrick this way. He is one of the players Ohio State should go after if he becomes available, but he's also one of the players Ohio State may not currently be able to realistically go after. If another ruling or NCAA decision changes that, then you could call him immediately. Because Ohio State's linebacker room does have ridiculous upside, I don't think it'll be as much of a priority to them, but you could still possibly see James Laurinaitis go after someone like that. I love the talent in this linebacker room, but there is somebody with that is a winner and has played in good situations here that could possibly help the Buckeyes. But none of those guys are, none of them are guys who could magically acquire anything like that. So keep this one bookmarked, but until the transfer issue changes, he's more of a fascinating, attainable player rather than like one that we're going to go after right now. And finally, number one, I have Zavian Harris. He's the rare player where almost every obstacle that we've discussed with the other four has pretty much already disappeared. His NFL contract is gone. Harris signed with the New Orleans Saints as an undrafted free agent in May. But he underwent foot surgery in March. He opened camp on the non-football injury list, and New Orleans waived him on August 8th with an injury designation. So it isn't currently an NFL roster he'd have to voluntarily abandon. In the second question, does he actually appear interested in using the new college opportunity? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Harris has already entered the transfer portal following the new ruling, and that's huge because entering the portal is a much stronger signal than simply being one of the players technically allowed to return. Harris is taking actions, and it doesn't guarantee that he's going to be a college football player this fall. He could still explore professional opportunities. He could decide just to let his foot rest as he is recovering, and he could choose another school. But of every player on this list, he's the easiest one with virtually no restrictions in front of him. This is no longer just a theoretical. And Ohio State would love to have a 6'8", 330-pound defensive tackle, especially a dude from the South like that. 52 career college games last season for Ole Miss. He had 58 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks. And he helped Ole Miss get all the way to the college football playoff semifinals, defeating Georgia in that run. If Ohio State makes one phone call because of this eligibility chaos, I want it to be Zavian Harris and the possibility to do that. If he can make the team better, right? If he can make the position room better. And Zavian Harris, I think, could make Ohio State better and add more to that rotation of the interior defensive line. Now, the foot injury has to be part of this conversation as well. You cannot ignore it. Harris had foot surgery in March, never got healthy enough to really compete in the New Orleans camp before he was waived. So before Ohio State does anything, their medical staff needs to have an answer to the question of what's going on with the foot. But if he's close, I would pursue it. Ohio State already has James Smith, Edric Houston, John Walker, Will Smith Jr., and I like that group, but adding a 330-pound, over 6'6" veteran in the rotation, that's when we're talking about something different, a difference maker. You don't need Harris to do 60 snaps a game. Give him 20 good snaps, put him in the goal line. help keep James Smith fresh, help keep Edric Houston fresh, absorb double teams, give Ohio State another gigantic body when somebody tries to run downhill in November. And remember the bigger goal. Ohio State isn't preparing for 12 football games. If this season ends where we want it to end, this team could be playing 15, 16, 16 or 17 games instead. Depth becomes incredibly valuable. So among these five, Harris is the one where I think the answer to all three questions is the strongest. Would he help improve Ohio State? Yes, you can never have enough rotation on the interior defensive line, especially somebody of Harris's size. Has his NFL opportunity, does he have an NFL opportunity currently blocking him from returning? No, he does not, which means there is actual evidence he's exploring the college football route when he entered the transfer portal. And to me, that's why he's number one. But the biggest factor in all of this is if Ohio State would actually pursue any player like this. And I can already hear some people as I'm going through this being like, John, okay, this is great. It's fun to talk about all this stuff, but they would never actually do it. And I can hear some of you, and I get that. But just being for real, okay? Ohio State, I agree to some extent. They are probably one of the least likely major programs in college football to aggressively test the boundaries of the new eligibility ruling because of its institutional history with NCAA compliance ever since Tattoogate, right? The fallout from the tattoos pushed Ohio State toward an extremely cautious level, a heavily resourced compliance department that makes it hard to imagine the Buckeyes taking a player whose eligibility, transfer status, or NFL contract is still a little murky. Ohio State would likely want complete clarity that a player is eligible, allowed to transfer, permitted to enroll, and free of professional contract issues before making any move. But on the flip side, the reason you still can't completely rule it out is that Ryan Day's recent roster building philosophy, ever since 2024, when Day took Julian Sayin after he promised Aaron Nolan he would not recruit another QB, or that he brought in Quinshon Judkins when he already had Travion Henderson, Day has been more cutthroat in his roster construction. Day has shown that when the rules clearly allow Ohio State to improve their championship chances, he will be aggressive in making that happen. Whether that means adding Julian Sayin or Quinshon Judkins or another major transfer addition, retaining veteran talent. So the most likely outcome is that Ohio State still stays away from these players while the legal situation remains, unsettled. But if compliance gives Day a definitive green light on somebody like Harris or Daquan Wright, then history suggests Day would be at least likely to explore it. And the big thing is that Ohio State doesn't have to be the school that tests the rules. Indiana has already added players through this ruling, and I expect more of these guys to be added to college football and be added to this season. So maybe the rule isn't crystal clear yet, but I also don't think it has to be exactly crystal clear for Ryan Day to be willing to use it. And this is also a very different enforcement environment now than back in the Tressel era. The NCAA has repeatedly been challenged and sometimes blocked in court over eligibility rules, which makes it much harder for organizations to simply declare one of these court-protected players ineligible and punish a school for using it. When the NCAA does still appear determined to show some teeth in the transfer process and tampering, in 2026 they adopted an automatic ghost transfer penalty that could include a 50% season suspension for the head coach and a fine equal to 20% of the sport's annual budget when a school circumvents the portal and it has continued pursuing impermissible contact. Ironically, Ohio State's bigger concern probably wouldn't be, will the NCAA punish us because a judge gave the guy another year? It would be making absolute certain the player is legally in the portal before recruiting him. And that's where Michigan, got their early contact and could be dinged with this. Now they got the thing going on with the tight end coach. That's a different thing than this, but could be with this as the players such as Trent Hendrick becomes more interesting. Hendrick has not entered the portal yet, and Colorado court later clarified that normal transfer restrictions still applied. But with guys like Wright and Harris in the portal, Ohio State could very well be calling them up, and we'll see if the Buckeyes can keep the Ole Miss pipeline coming for another year. Thanks so much for listening to the Buckeye Huddle podcast. Appreciate you being here. And please do like, subscribe the video if you want to see more of this stuff. We're back here every Sunday through Thursday at 7 p.m. New videos, new topics, new things to talk about. We got fall camp still going on. We're going to continue to talk about that, continue to talk about everything that's going on with the Buckeyes. You can catch it all here on the Big Ten Huddle podcast on the podcast feed or youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. Thanks so much for listening and watching, everybody. We appreciate it. Have a good one.